Hello guys, welcome to another video. And yesterday we covered what I think is the most broken of the new ascendancies in the Legacy of Phrecia event. That's the Scion, the Scavenger ascendancy. But in today's video, we're going to be looking at what is possibly the tankiest ascendancy that they've made. And this is the Ancestral Commander. It's a Marauder ascendancy, and pretty much all of the nodes on the tree, almost all of them, are fully defensive nodes, and they stack up to make an incredibly tanky character. Let's get straight into it, beginning with Ancestral Endurance here, which is +3 to maximum endurance charges. So this would have been crazy even if it was +2, but +3 is ridiculous. This class is going to be able to get the highest amount of maximum endurance charges on any current build, and I believe it may be beaten by Legacy gear in Standard, but +3 is kind of ridiculous. So I was actually looking into this a little bit and thinking about how many endurance charges could you possibly obtain with this character. And I worked out that you would be able to get a maximum of 17 brutal charges. That's the charges that you gain from the Arn's Anguish belt. That's this one here. That's a Maven belt, which converts endurance charges essentially into brutal charges. So you lose the benefit of actually having endurance charges, but you gain a brutal charge for each endurance charge. And these actually provide 3% chance to deal triple damage per charge, so they're very powerful. And so you'll be able to get a theoretical maximum of 17 brutal charges or 16 endurance charges. You have 3 baseline, then you have 3 from the passive skill tree and 3 from this ascendancy, that is already 9. Then you have 2 maximum endurance charges from your ring slots, and then you also have an eventuality rod there, which can be Shaper influenced to also get an additional one as an explicit modifier on it. So that's another potential +2 from that. Then you have the boot slot, which can either be Death's Door or a crafted Warlord influence boots for the +1 actually on the item itself, and then these can then be corrupted for another +1 on the corrupted implicit. That's another +2 from the boot slot there. Then you could use a Determination Sublime Vision Jewel for another +1 to maximum endurance charges there. And that would come to a total of 16 endurance charges, and then if you wanted to, you could get another +1 from the Arn's Anguish belt, which would then convert all of those endurance charges into brutal charges, and that would be 17 brutal charges. Now, that's obviously a theoretical maximum there, and it's not very realistic. For example, the Eventuality Rod, a Shaper item, very, very difficult to craft depending on what build you're playing, and getting a corrupted pair of Death's Door or a corrupted crafted Warlord influence boots, again, extremely difficult. And there's also the fact there that most builds do not want to be using a Determination Sublime Vision because that disables all of your other aura skills. So that's not really a very realistic maximum, that's just a theoretical maximum that you could actually get to. So in terms of a more realistic setup, you're going to be looking at about 13 maximum endurance charges. That is 3 baseline, 3 from the passive skill tree, 3 from the ascendancy, 2 from rings, 1 from an eventuality rod, or a synthesized implicit two-hander, or a synthesized shield implicit. That would be 12, and then you can get 1 from your boot slot, either using Death's Door, or a crafted pair of Warlord boots, or a corrupted boot implicit, which would bring you up to 13, or if you are using Radakesh's Impatience, you could then use Arn's Anguish, which would also bring you to 13. However, with that setup, you would benefit from the defensive aspect of those 13 endurance charges, at the same time as actually having the ability to gain brutal charges. So you will not only be gaining a huge amount of additional physical damage reduction from having those 13 endurance charges active all of the time, but you'll also have the potential to build up all of that triple damage there as well with 13 brutal charges. Of course, that setup can also get even stronger later on in the very late game. When you have a ton of currency to spend, you can actually get a corrupted pair of Radakesh's Impatience for +1 maximum endurance charge on the implicit, which would bring that setup to 14 total endurance charges and 14 brutal charges. So that is absolutely extreme, and that's going to be a ridiculous amount of defense. Without the really high budget setup there of actually having a corrupted pair of Radakesh, you'll end up having around 50% additional physical damage reduction and 50% additional elemental damage reduction just from your endurance charges, which is just a ridiculous amount of defense. So that actually comes from your first lab there if you want to take it. you're likely going to be wanting to path through the endurance charge nodes anyway, and likely go down to the bottom of the tree there, where you can take the minimum endurance charge node, which also allows you to gain endurance charges from kills, and that's just really nice in the campaign. As well as making use of Enduring Cry, you're just going to be able to cruise through the campaign, and most things are not really going to be dealing much of any damage to you at all because of all those endurance charges. And the crazy thing about this is the node that then comes after it, which is another fully defensive node, Ancestral Defiance. Now this is the Defiance of Destiny modifier right here. Gain 15% of missing unreserved life before being hit by an enemy. Now, Defiance of Destiny is a ridiculous amulet. I believe it's a tier 0 rarity unique amulet. And the reason why this amulet is so rare and so powerful is because it provides you a recovery method that happens before you actually take damage from a hit. So when a hit comes in, once the hit is actually confirmed to hit your character, before the damage is calculated, you then recover life based on how much life is missing. So for example, on this modifier here, gain 15% of missing unreserved life before being hit by an enemy. If you have, for example, 2,000 out of 5,000 maximum life, you'll recover 450 life before the hit actually deals damage to you. So that is extremely strong, and you can actually stack this with Defiance of Destiny. You're going to be able to grab a Defiance of Destiny if you can afford it at some point in the league, and you can actually stack that modifier with this one here, and they'll stack additively. And that means that you're actually going to be able to get close to a pre-nerfed Defiance of Destiny. So if you didn't know, Defiance of Destiny actually got nerfed in the most recent patch. It went from 25 to 35%, which could actually be increased to 42% with catalysts, down to 10 to 20%, which only goes up to 24% with catalysts. And with a 24% Defiance of Destiny, you're going to be able to get up to 39%, so you're closing in on that pre-nerf Defiance of Destiny at that point, and that is just extremely strong. Once again, this node is going to feel so nice taking it in the campaign. You're just going to feel really kind of immortal with these nodes. But one thing to notice immediately on this Ascendancy that, if you're taking those nodes there, you don't have any damage coming from your Ascendancy whatsoever. So you may be feeling the pinch a little bit in terms of damage, depending on how you're leveling. But usually, if you're taking like a strong leveling setup, for example, if you're playing melee, you just run through the campaign with Sunder or Earth Shatter or something like that, and you should be feeling just fine in terms of leveling. Next up, we have the Forest of Ancestors node here, which is +1 to maximum number of summoned totems, and 20% of damage from hits is taken from your nearest totem's life before you. So +1 to the maximum number of summoned totems is quite strong, and 20% of damage from hits taken from your nearest totem's life before you is once again another really strong defensive modifier. You can actually stack this with the Totem Mastery for 5% of the same stat, so that would bring that up to 25%. And I'll actually come back to the Totem node a little bit later on in this video when I discuss what you can actually do with totems on this Ascendancy. But this is another strong node and a different avenue you could go down there in terms of offense and just stacking up more and more defense there. Now over on the right here we have Toughened Skin, which is another 1-point node just like that totem node there. And this is action speed cannot be modified to below base value, movement speed cannot be modified to below base value, and armor from equipped body armor is doubled. Now these first two modifiers are extremely powerful. You'll recognize them from the Unstoppable node on the Juggernaut in the current game. Action speed cannot be modified to below base value. Now how this works is, unless you have some kind of action speed increase, for example an acceleration shrine or tailwind, you will be effectively immune to chill and freeze and temporal chains and any other action speed slows, because your normal action speed is always at base value because you don't have any increases, and therefore it cannot be modified to below that base value, and you're effectively immune to all of that stuff from slowing you down because it's just an action speed slow. The second line, movement speed cannot be modified to below base value, is only going to set your base value as the minimum. So for any other increases that you have to movement speed, for example, you're going to commonly have a movement speed increase on your boots. You may have onslaught and things like this. Anything that actually increases your movement speed above that base value will still be able to be removed by any debuffs that slow you down. But it cannot go below base value, and the base value is obviously your movement speed without any kind of increases from gear and elsewhere. Now the last line there, armor from equipped body armor is doubled, is also from the Juggernaut from a different node. and that's just going to double whatever armor you're gaining from your body armor. So a notable selection for that is, of course, Brass Dome, which can get very high and also provides a bunch of maximum resistances and makes you effectively immune from the extra damage from any incoming critical strikes there. But it doesn't provide any life, and it also prevents strength from providing maximum life. So this is quite a big life loss from Brass Dome. But much more likely there is that you use a Royal Plate, and of course then you can craft a ridiculous amount of armor on here and you'll be able to double that up. It also means you can get life modifiers on there, you can get Eldritch Implicits, you can get resistances, you can get additional physical damage reduction and stats and all of the good things. So you're likely to want to use a crafted Royal Plate, and that is going to be extremely strong in terms of getting a massive amount of armor from that node. Now, before we move on to the Warcry stuff and actually discuss some of the builds that I think you could use on this Ascendancy, I want to actually quickly discuss this node over here, which is a cluster, a selection node where you can choose different spirits, and these are from the Trial of the Ancestors. This was actually a tattoo system from the Loyalty Tattoos. So let's go through each of these, beginning with the Spirit of Calm. And one important thing to mention here is that all of these nodes will trigger a level 20 summon spirit, and the tattoos that were previously in the game did not specify a level, and I think there's a reason for that, because I think these skills are actually going to be modified a little bit compared to how they worked in Trial of the Ancestors. And the reason for that is that in the Trial of the Ancestors, you could apply these tattoos, and they were actually limited to one, so you could only get one loyalty tattoo. And how these work is they have a decent duration there, 12 seconds, but they have a very long cooldown, 80 seconds, and they usually provide quite a strong effect. But during the Trial of the Ancestors, of course, you had a large access to tattoos, and these loyalty tattoos would actually be buffed up by having tattoos of a specific type. So for example, for this one here, the Calm tattoo, you would gain a 20% increased effect of this spirit when it's summoned, based on how many Namahu tattoos you actually had on your passive skill tree. Now, I believe that the level 20 version of these skills has been changed because tattoos are no longer anywhere near as accessible as they were in the Trial of the Ancestors, and I actually think that this whole scaling based on tattoos will be gone, and this will just be a standalone skill which is a little bit stronger than what it was during the Trial of the Ancestors, based on the fact that you can no longer scale it with this. So my guess is that this will actually be a stronger effect. It may even have a lower cooldown, but I should think it will mainly account for the fact that you can no longer scale it based on having extra tattoos. So for the Spirit of Calm, it summons a level 20 Spirit of Calm when a totem dies while a unique enemy is in your presence. So very, very specific wording there. A totem must die while you're in the presence of a unique enemy, and this will spawn a Calm Spirit there, which is a minion, and the Spirit is invulnerable. It doesn't take any damage or anything like that. And this one grants a buff that causes 15% of the damage from hits to be taken from your nearest totem's life before you. So once again, you can stack up more of that stat that you get on the Ascendancy elsewhere there on one of the other nodes, and it's more damage taken from a totem's life before you. But in my opinion, and this goes for a lot of the Spirit nodes here, they need to have a much higher uptime than they did in the Trial of the Ancestors for any of these to even be considered as an option on this Ascendancy. So hopefully this is not 12 seconds with an 80-second cooldown. That would be very disappointing. And then we have the Spirit of Kahu Turoa there, which is this one right here. And this is spawned when you take a critical strike from a unique enemy. So once again, very specific in terms of how you actually spawn this spirit. You have to take a critical strike from a unique enemy, which is something you don't really want to be doing, I think. And this one makes 10% of your armor apply to non-physical damage taken from hits, which is a very strong buff there. But once again, as I mentioned with the other one, this needs to have either a much higher uptime or it needs to have a much stronger buff there for it to actually be considered as an option. Then we have the Spirit of Utula, which is triggered on taking a savage hit from a unique enemy. So a savage hit is specifically a hit which removes 15% of maximum life. It doesn't count for any other resource like ward or energy shield or anything like that. It must remove 15% of your maximum life to be considered as a savage hit. And that will spawn a Spirit of Utula there. And this one makes a percentage of your leech be instant, 25% of instant leech there. And then we have the Spirit of Kiloava, which is triggered when you block damage from a unique enemy. And that one grants a recover on block buff there, 5% of life, mana, and energy shield recovered when you block. And lastly, we have the Spirit of Rakiata there, which is triggered on critical strike against marked unique enemy. So of all of these, this one is actually the easiest one to spawn in terms of being deterministic. You know, you don't have to wait to actually block a hit, or you don't have to wait to take a savage hit, or wait to take a critical strike or something like that. This one you can actually trigger when you want to trigger it on a critical strike against a marked unique enemy. And this is really the only offensive one of all of these. So the Rakiata Spirit there will make it so that your action speed is always a minimum of 110% of base value, which is quite strong. But once again, all of these spirit buffs must either have a higher uptime or they need to be stronger baseline to be considered as an option, especially when there are so many strong nodes here on this tree. Now, moving on to one of the other nodes here, the Call of the Ancestors, which is 30% reduced Warcry speed and 120% increased Warcry cooldown recovery rate. So immediately, just looking at this is exceptionally good with auto-exertion support, because auto-exertion, of course, it triggers your Warcries, which means it doesn't matter how fast your Warcry speed is, it's always triggered, and therefore you don't need to actually wait for its cast time. But there's the massive benefit there of the 120% Warcry CDR, which is really, really strong. That's a huge amount of that stat. And immediately, this node enables a build here with the maximum charges, and this is what a lot of people have actually been looking at and building into and making builds for this class right here, which is a General's Cry build. So you make use of that Warcry node, you make use of the maximum charges, and you use General's Cry with Tectonic Slam of Cataclysm. So how this actually works is this attack skill here, the Tectonic Slam of Cataclysm, it gains a massive amount of more damage per endurance charge and more area effect per endurance charge, but when you actually use the attack, it consumes all of those charges to empower the attack with all of this damage and area effect and stuff like that. However, the interaction with General's Cry is that when you actually spawn General's Cry Mirages, they spawn with your endurance charges, but they only attack once and they do not spend your endurance charges. They spend their endurance charges, but they only use a single attack. So they use that attack and then they despawn, which means that as long as you're able to generate your own endurance charges and keep them up, you can just continuously spam General's Cry and fully benefit from all of that bonus damage coming in from the Tectonic Slam on each of those Mirages that use that skill. Going back to the Ascendancy and going back to that Totem node, one of the other ways that you can utilize this exact build is with Totems instead of General's Cry, or even in combination with General's Cry. For that, you would be using the Dawnstrider boots, because of course Earthbreaker support was removed from the game as a skill gem, and the only way you can actually get this now is on these pair of boots. But this works in a very similar way. If you use Earthbreaker support to actually make totems that then use Tectonic Slam of Cataclysm, they'll essentially be using the attack as if they were spending those endurance charges, so they gain all of that extra damage and area effect and fissure branching chance, but they don't actually spend your endurance charges. So that's a very, very strong combination of mechanics you can use there. The General's Cry setup is generally better because it's a lot more damage, but the totem angle is there as well. Now, the Call of the Ancestors, going back to auto-exertion support, it is of course also just really good in a build that just shoves a bunch of Warcries in this skill and just has them trigger over and over again. As long as you have enough attack speed to actually keep up with those exerts, you can spam those empowered attacks. Now, behind Call of the Ancestors is Deathrattle, and this makes nearby corpses explode when you Warcry, dealing 12% of their life as physical damage. Your Warcries open chests. So a nice little bonus there of Warcries opening chests. But the main thing here is your Warcries exploding nearby corpses. Now you can combine this node with the Calm's Command unique helmet there, which is providing the same modifier there for a little bit lower value. Nearby corpses explode when you Warcry, dealing 5 to 10% of their life as physical damage. And there's also some large Warcry area effects there as well, and Warcry speed. So you could do something there where you're able to just kind of spam Warcries, and that's going to help your clear a lot. And there were some builds back in Affliction League which actually use this setup to deal a lot of damage and kind of use this as their main damage source in a build. So that is something you could look at there. Now moving on to the Strike branch here. We've got two notables. So the first one that comes off of the start is Ancestral Reach. Strike skills which target additional enemies can do so from 50% further away, and non-Vow strike skills target one additional nearby enemy. So immediately you're satisfying the prerequisite of the first modifier there with the second one. So all of your strike skills are going to be targeting additional enemies because this already provides an additional target here, and can do so from 50% further away is massive range. I believe the old mastery for this was 30%. I may be misremembering that, but I think it was 30%. So I'm sure many of you have seen ridiculous strike builds, for example, Khan playing Bone Chatter where he's attacking from halfway across the screen. And this is what you're going to see with this node here. You're just going to see ridiculous strike range coming in. And this one is just really, really nice quality of life for strike skills. And then we have Ancestral Echo that comes behind it, which is strike skills also target the previous location they were used. Now, this may sound kind of cool, but the problem with this node is actually that it already exists in the game and we already know how it works. So Warrior's Legacy is a unique ring, and it grants the same modifier there. Strike skills also target the previous location they were used. And the problem with this is that it's either bugged or it's just not very good functionality. The way it works is that for it to actually target the previous location, you need to move a minimum distance away from that location for the strike to actually happen. And this can work with flicker strike. For example, if you're flicker striking around, you'll constantly trigger that extra strike there at the previous location where that hit happened. And it can work on the single target as long as the enemy is actually large enough that you move that minimum distance away. But it's generally very awkward to have to keep moving to actually get this to proc. So overall, I'm not convinced about Ancestral Echo. I think that modifier is a little bit too awkward to use. Now, the last notable in this ascendancy is a really cool one. It's called Born Under Fire. Nearby enemies convert 50% of their physical damage to fire. So first of all, what is nearby? Well, this modifier already exists in the game. It's on the Calm's Binding unique belt there, and this one is nearby enemies convert 25% of their physical damage to fire, and we actually have the nearby there, which is 6 meter radius. So I can actually show you that over here on Path of Building. This is a 6 meter radius. You can see the character right here. And every enemy that's actually standing in this radius and is hitting you will have their physical damage converted to fire. And any monster that's actually sitting outside this radius, ranged monsters that are hitting you from outside of the circle, will not have that conversion going on. So that's one of the big disadvantages of this node compared to damage taken as. However, the modifier on Calm's Binding and on this ascendancy here does have a little bit of a benefit compared to damage taken as, in that damage conversion and damage taken as are not the same. Damage conversion happens on the attacker's side of the calculation, which means that this damage conversion will affect any kind of damaging ailment that the target is inflicting because they only care about the originating hit damage. So one of the best examples I can provide there is that if you have a monster that is hitting you with puncture and they deal pure physical damage there, that bleed is going to deal quite a lot of damage. But if 50% of their damage is converted to fire, they now only have half of their damage contributing to that bleed because the other half is being converted to fire damage and therefore cannot contribute to the puncture bleed. However, notably, if the damage is being converted to fire on the attacker's side, that means that they can ignite with this damage, and that means that if that attack hits you with a critical strike, or if the monster has inherent ignite chance, they can actually ignite with this damage. You can, of course, stack this up with Calm's Binding to convert 75% of nearby monster damage from physical to fire, and do keep in mind that conversion only works for hit damage. It doesn't work for damage over time, it's only for hits. And there you have it, easily one of the tankiest ascendancies we've ever seen in Path of Exile, and I think this one will be very popular in the upcoming Event League. We've already seen a bunch of people theory crafting those General's Cry builds on this ascendancy, and I think it's going to be really, really strong. Are you guys eyeing up this ascendancy for your league launch into the legacy of Phrecia? Let me know by commenting below. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.